Hi, I'm Kendall Kelton, and I'm your host today on The Rough Draft. Featuring honest conversations with folks from across the creative industry, The Rough Draft explores the creative process, tools, and resources used by some of the best in the business. From journalists to content creators and business leaders, we shed light on what it looks like to break into the industry, make mistakes, collaborate with others, and the essential tools that help us all along the way. This week, I'm super excited to be talking with Jamilah King. Jamilah is an editorial director at Mother Jones and oversees a team of investigative reporters covering race, politics, criminal justice, and more. She previously worked as a managing editor at Buzzfeed, and as a reporter, she's profiled Kamala Harris, Stacey Abrams, and Lucy McBath. Her work has also appeared on HBO, Showtime, and CNN. On today's episode, Jamilah is going to tell us about her creative process, adapting to multi-platform journalism, and her editorial approach. I want to kind of talk about your storytelling. And you in particular have reported on such sensitive and nuanced issues. And I want to kind of understand a bit more about your process for ensuring your stories, yes, they're investigative, but they're also deeply human. And so I want to just get a peek behind the curtain a bit about how you approach your work. You've done long form content, you've done podcasts. Is there a particular channel that you are called to kind of push your stories and your work forward?
I think I would have said 5 years ago it was writing, but I'm pretty platform agnostic these days. I think that we're, as consumers, we are so inundated with storytelling that and it comes at us from all different angles. And I think we have to kind of adopt that attitude as producers and editors and reporters. I will say that I've really loved audio, really appreciate the intimacy of that platform. And also there's some nuances in that, right? Like I think there's some nuances in terms of how, as a reporter, you approach those stories. What makes good tape for audio is not necessarily going to work in a written piece. Ideally, all of these platforms work together, right? Like I think at Mother Jones right now, we're trying to figure out a way to make individual stories work on a bunch of different platforms.
Yeah. And people are just absorbing content in different ways. They could have once been a voracious reader. They have a busy life now. They have to catch something really quick. It's a newsletter, or maybe it's a podcast on, their commute to work. And I have to imagine like having to think about all the different ways you have to put one single story out there in the world. You find a lot of creative joy in walking that, if I read that correctly.
Sure do. Sure do.
So are there things that you constantly go to like refill your creative cup, or just to get like your writing or thought process or editing kind of going?
Yeah, I'm a big walker. I've always been a big walker. I've loved taking super long walks. I'm lucky to have lived in really walkable cities. And so for me, whether it's walking my dog or just taking long walks by myself, and recently it's been running, but doing those things without distraction, so without headphones, which is a whole...
That's so impressive.
It's a really different thing. I've always been really, really inspired, particularly by runners who are able to run without any headphones, without any distractions, because I think that is the hardest thing in the world to do.
I agree.
So, but it is a really interesting practice in figuring out how to tune in to your breathing and also surprise yourself with what things come up. Right. I realize that, as I run, or even if I'm walking, I'm usually daydreaming and it's aspirational. And if I'm aspirational, I can dream and think of all these cool things I want to do. If I'm present, I'm like working through an issue or a particular problem, or maybe ruminating and going over something again and again, but like also just trying to sit with what's present. So for me, movement is really important.
There's some people who are, collaboration is fun in some instances and not in others. And I think when you're an editor in particular, collaboration has to be so essential to the relationships with your staff. So I'd love to kind of understand how you approach that in journalism, what your take is on it?
So for me, the process of journalism has always been deeply collaborative because it has always been, I write this thing, it kind of makes sense. Usually it doesn't. So I have an editor who helps me get it into shape. I have a copy editor who makes sure that everything is tidy. I have a fact checker, if I'm lucky, who's able to go through and tell me what I've gotten wrong. I have even a web editor who's able to stage a story. I have all of these people who I'm relying on to make the story happen. And I'm really aware of that. I'm definitely aware of it as an editor who's been in charge of kind of pulling all these pieces together and getting them out into the world. And I think the thing that we miss in this moment of, influencers and creators who are kind of tasked with doing things completely on their own is that they don't have that sort of backup, that whether it's an institution, whether it's an editor, whether, it's not just for the sake of being able to say, hey, I have a team. It's, to help offload some of the work, and to that collaboration means that you have more opportunities for people to catch things. You have more opportunities for people to help make things better. And so the onus isn't completely on you.
So you mentioned fact checking, and I'm interested because the amount of information coming out these days and the risk of misinformation is pretty high. And AI is a thing that people use for, we'll say, good or evil at this point. How do you see the utilization of AI becoming more prevalent in newsrooms? But how do you see this misinformation impacting reporting at Mother Jones or elsewhere?
Yeah, I'll start with the second half of that question. So I think we just saw it this week with Hurricane Milton. You saw so much misinformation flooding around the internet. And I think it's difficult to figure out how to have that conversation with folks, because on the one hand, it ultimately becomes a conversation about privilege, right? Like, who has access to information that is vetted, that is fact-checked? That is sort of the environment that we live in when you're looking at all these storied institutions that have their reporting behind a paywall. The free content that we have access to is usually questionable, right? But also the bar to entry is lower. And so it is easier to sort of be someone who has traditionally been locked out of the industry and say, you know what, I'm going to start my own thing and it's going to be a great thing. But then you have platforms that incentivize, creating constantly. And so it's just this wild beast that just keeps growing and growing and growing. I think that, there definitely needs to be more of a conversation around media literacy that's not centered on shame, because I think people tend to do the best they can with what they've got and what's interesting to them, right? In terms of AI, definitely when AI first became a really big thing in 2023 for me, I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, we're all doomed, right? And then I was able to sort of walk that back a little bit. I was lucky to go to the Maynard Institute training, which is an annual training in Texas. And I was able to meet a professor at Boston University, Michelle Johnson. And it was just really helpful for me because she basically would just explain what was happening, but also how you could use these things as reporters, right? So how can you make something like ChatGPT or Copilot or Gemini useful for you? How do you take a data set, for instance, and throw it in there and make your work as a reporter more feasible? And so that really helped shift my perspective and say, okay, this is useful as a tool, and like every tool, it's going to be scary in the beginning, just like the internet was scary in the beginning. But now we see it more as a tool. So really, it's just my facility with that tool.
So let's talk a bit about tools. Are there any tools that you're like, these are the things that every reporter should use today? Or if somebody were entering their career, this is a thing that even if you have $3 to your name, you should invest in?
So a couple things. I think a YouTube premium subscription is key, just because you get access. You don't have to deal with ads and all that. But I found that it's really important to keep up with changes on platforms or with specific individual tools that I use. So if there's, a program that I use, even Microsoft Word, honestly, Microsoft Word now is not the same Microsoft Word that I used as a kid. It's totally different, right? So just having somebody explain that to me on YouTube is helpful. There's also an app called TickTick, which is a task app. The way that I have learned how to use it is really helpful in that it helps you sort of collate your tasks based on different buckets, but also the immediacy. I would also recommend Canva. Not even just like making stuff look cool, but just having the confidence or having the sort of visual mindset.
Well, thank you for sharing a bit more about like your process. And I think we're all going to maybe walk out of here trying to avoid using their headphones on their next walk or run. I don't know to what success, but we'll try.
It's really hard.
Well, for our next episode, I actually want to focus on your in-depth reporting, particularly on Black women in politics, such as Kamala Harris, especially with the upcoming election just around the corner. Well, that's it for today's episode of The Rough Draft. Be sure to rate and subscribe in order to stay up to date with the latest episodes and visit rev.com/podcasts for even more content. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of The Rough Draft.